The cuffs were already closing around her wrists before Mara Ellison finished her sentence. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and fried onions, the kind of smell that clung to her uniform no matter how many times she washed it. It was almost midnight, and the only customers left were 4 men who had walked in an hour ago, wearing leather jackets, and the kind of confidence that made the other waitresses drop their eyes and hurry away. Mara did not hurry. She never did. She had noticed them the second they walked through the door. Not because they were dangerous looking, though they were, but because of the way they moved. Every step was measured. Every glance around the room was quick and sharp, like they were counting exits without meaning to. She had waited tables long enough to know the difference between men who were simply rude and men who believed the world owed them silence. These 4 believed the second thing completely. The one giving orders sat with his back straight and his chin lifted, the way people sit when they expect a room to arrange itself around them. He had not looked at the menu. He had not looked at her either, not really, until he wanted something. "Water," he said, snapping 2 fingers in her direction, without lifting his eyes from his phone. Mara set down the water glass without a word. She had dealt with worse. She had dealt with much worse, once, though nobody in this town would ever guess that from looking at her now. It was the second time he did it that something in her chest went tight. "More water," he said again, snapping his fingers exactly the same way, as if she were a dog he was training. "There's a jug on the table," Mara said evenly, "right in front of you." The words were not cruel. They were not even loud. But the man's head turned slowly, and for the first time that night, he actually looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said there's a jug of water right there," Mara repeated, calm, steady. "You don't need to call me over for it." The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your ears. The other 3 men at the table went still, the way animals go still before something happens, watching their friend with a mixture of amusement and something closer to alarm. One of them, younger, with sandy hair and nervous eyes, actually looked away, as if he didn't want to watch what came next. The man across from Mara set his phone down slowly, deliberately, the small click of it against the table louder than it had any right to be. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. His voice had dropped, gone quiet in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "No," Mara said honestly. "Should I?" She would think about that question many times in the days that followed. Should I? 2 small words that would change everything. The man rose from his seat so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from more than a gym membership. His name, though Mara did not know it yet, was Kane Voss, and he was used to rooms falling silent the moment he stood up in them. He was used to being obeyed before he finished a sentence. He had spent years building a reputation that made grown men lower their eyes, and he had never once, not in all that time, been questioned by someone wearing a name tag that read Mara in faded plastic letters. "You don't talk back to me," Kane said, and his hand shot out, closing around her wrist before she could step back. "Let go of me," Mara said, her voice sharp now, sharp enough to cut through the low music playing from the diner's ancient speakers. "You're going to learn some respect," Kane said, and from his jacket pocket he pulled a set of metal cuffs, the kind that glinted under the fluorescent lights, in a way that made the last customer at the counter gasp and grab her purse like she wanted to disappear into the wall. "What are you doing?" Mara demanded, twisting against his grip, but he was strong, far stronger than any ordinary man had a right to be, and her wrist bent painfully as he forced her arm behind her back. "I'm teaching you what happens when you disrespect someone with real power," Kane said, and the cuff clicked shut around one wrist, cold and final. The other waitress on shift, a heavy-set older woman named Grace who had worked at the diner for 11 years and had seen every kind of trouble walk through its doors, froze behind the counter with the coffee pot still in her hand. She did not move to help. She did not call out. Something in her had already understood what none of the customers in that room fully grasped yet, which was that the 4 men at that table were not the kind of men the police got called on. They were something else, something that made even brave people go quiet. "You can't do this," Mara said, and there was no fear in her voice, only fury, the kind of fury that comes from being underestimated one too many times. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to know you," Kane said, forcing her second wrist into the cuff, sealing it with a second sharp click. "I need you to learn your place." He began pulling her toward the door, one hand gripping her upper arm, the other resting on the small of her back in a way that was meant to look controlled, and instead looked like exactly what it was. The younger man with the sandy hair, the nervous one, half rose from his seat, his mouth opening as if to say something, but a look from one of the older men beside him pushed him back down into silence. The bell above the diner door jingled. It was such a small, ordinary sound. It was the same sound that rang out 50 times a night, every time a trucker or a teenager or a tired night shift nurse walked in for coffee. But this time, the sound seemed to land differently, as if the air itself had changed the moment the door opened. Kane did not notice at first. He was too focused on dragging Mara toward the exit, too focused on proving a point that only he seemed to care about anymore, because every other man in that diner had gone rigid. It was Grace who reacted first. The coffee pot slipped from her hand and shattered against the tile floor, sending dark liquid splashing across her white sneakers. She did not seem to notice that either. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway, wide and disbelieving, as if she were looking at something that should not exist in a roadside diner at midnight. "Kane," said a voice from the door, low and quiet, and yet somehow it filled every corner of the room the way Kane's own raised voice never had. Kane's hand loosened on Mara's arm, without him seeming to realize it. He turned, slowly, the color already draining from his face before he had even fully seen who stood there. A man had stepped into the diner, dressed simply, a dark coat over plain clothes, nothing about his appearance suggesting wealth or power or anything remarkable at all. And yet every man at that table, every single one of them, had gone rigid the instant they saw him, the way soldiers go rigid at the sight of a general they never expected to see walk through the door of a roadside diner in the middle of the night. His eyes moved across the room once, taking in the shattered coffee pot, the frightened customer near the counter, the sandy-haired young man frozen halfway out of his seat. And then his gaze landed on Mara, on the cuffs around her wrists, on the raw red mark already forming where Kane's fingers had dug into her skin. Something shifted in his face. It was there and gone in an instant, so quick that Mara almost thought she had imagined it. But for that single heartbeat, the calm, controlled expression cracked into something that looked almost like disbelief, almost like recognition, almost like grief. "Let her go," he said, and though his voice did not rise even slightly, the words landed in the room like a physical weight. "Sir, I didn't know you would be," Kane began, releasing Mara's arm so suddenly she nearly stumbled. "I said let her go," the man repeated, and this time there was something underneath the calm, something that made even the water glasses on the table seem to tremble slightly. Kane's hands went to his sides, empty and useless, the confidence that had filled him only moments earlier draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. He had been so certain, so entirely certain, that tonight he was simply putting a rude waitress in her place. He had never imagined, not for one single second, that the man walking through that door would look at her the way he was looking at her now. Mara stood very still, her cuffed wrists held awkwardly in front of her, staring at the stranger, who had just silenced a room full of men twice her size, with nothing but 2 sentences. She did not know his name. She did not know why every man at that table had gone pale at the sight of him, or why the older waitress behind the counter looked as though she might faint. But something in her chest, something old and buried and carefully locked away for years, stirred at the sight of his face. A face she had told herself, over and over, that she would never see again. "Are you hurt?" the man asked her, his voice softer now, though his eyes had not left Kane, who stood frozen beside the table like a man waiting for a verdict. "I'm fine," Mara said, though her voice shook slightly, more from confusion than fear. "Who are you?" The man did not answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room in a few long strides and reached for the cuffs still binding her wrists, examining them with a kind of quiet fury that made even the sandy-haired young man shrink further into his seat. "These will be off in a moment," he said, and then, turning his head slightly toward Kane without fully looking at him, added, "Give me the key, now." Kane fumbled in his jacket pocket, his hands shaking in a way they had not shaken all night, not even when Mara had first talked back to him. He produced a small silver key and held it out, not daring to step closer than necessary to hand it over. The stranger took it without a word and turned back to Mara, his focus narrowing entirely onto her, as if the rest of the room, the rest of the world, had simply ceased to exist. As the first cuff clicked open and fell away from her wrist, he looked up and met her eyes properly for the first time. And in that look, brief as it was, Mara saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Not the look of a stranger helping someone in trouble. Something far older than that. Something that reached back years, to a version of herself she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it no longer existed. The second cuff fell away. "You're safe now," the man said quietly, and the words carried a weight that had nothing to do with the cuffs at all. Behind him, still frozen by the table, none of the other men had moved. And in the strange, ringing silence that followed, Mara Ellison realized, with a slow and creeping certainty, that her ordinary life at this ordinary diner had just come to an end. The man who had freed her hands turned at last to face the four men still standing frozen by their table, and the moment he did, something in the room changed entirely. It was as though a switch had been thrown. Every soldier straight man among them, including Kane, dropped his gaze to the floor and pressed a fist against his chest, in a gesture so practiced, so automatic, that Mara understood at once it had been drilled into them since childhood. "Alpha," Kane said, his voice barely above a whisper, the word cracking slightly as it left his mouth. "Alpha." The word rolled through the diner like distant thunder, and Mara felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath her feet. She had heard that word before, long ago, in a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. She had heard it shouted across muddy fields and murmured in hushed war rooms. She had heard it, once, whispered against her ear in the dark, from lips that had promised her things she no longer let herself believe in. She looked up at the man standing beside her, really looked at him now that the shock of the cuffs had faded enough to let her see clearly, and her stomach dropped. Older, yes. His face carried lines it had not carried before, faint marks of years that had clearly not been easy ones. His hair was cut shorter, more severe, and there was a heaviness in the way he held his shoulders that had not been there the last time she had seen him. But the eyes were the same, dark, steady, and fixed on her now, with an intensity that made her want to step backward and forward at the same time. "Damien," she said, so quietly that only he could have heard it. His jaw tightened at the sound of his name in her voice, and for a moment, neither of them said anything else. The rest of the diner seemed to hold its breath along with them. Kane, still frozen with his fist pressed to his chest, finally found enough courage to speak. "Alpha, I did not know she was—" "You did not know who she was," Damien said, cutting him off without raising his voice, "because you never bothered to ask before you decided she deserved to be cuffed like a criminal." "She spoke back to me," Kane said, and even as the words left his mouth he seemed to realize how small they sounded now. "She told you where the water was," Damien said flatly. "That is what happened. I heard every word of it from the parking lot before I even opened that door." The younger man with sandy hair, the one who had half risen earlier and then thought better of it, kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, clearly grateful he had not been the one to speak first. Mara rubbed at her wrists, the skin still faintly marked from the cuffs, and tried to steady her breathing. She had spent 5 years building a life far away from anything resembling this world, a life of double shifts, and small apartments, and evenings so quiet she sometimes forgot what silence used to cost her. And now, in the space of 10 minutes, all of it had come crashing back. "Someone want to explain to me," she said, forcing her voice to stay level, "why 4 grown men are apparently terrified of a guy in a plain coat." A ripple went through the room at her words. Kane's head snapped up, disbelief plain on his face, as if the idea of speaking so casually to the Alpha had never once crossed his mind as something a person could survive. Even Grace, still standing behind the counter with broken glass and spilled coffee at her feet, made a small strangled sound. Damien, however, did something none of them expected. He almost smiled. It was faint, barely there, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Mara saw it, and something about the familiarity of that near smile hollowed out a space in her chest she had thought long since filled in. "This is Damien Ashgrove," Kane said carefully, as if introducing him properly might undo some of the damage already done. "He leads every pack from the northern ridge to the coast. He is not simply a man in a coat. He leads the entire territory," added the older of the 2 silent men at the table, his voice hushed with something close to reverence. "There is no one above him. No one." Mara absorbed this slowly, turning the words over, matching them against the man she remembered. 5 years ago, Damien had been powerful, yes, respected, yes. But he had also been a man still fighting to hold his position, still surrounded by rivals who doubted whether a leader who kept a human close to his side could ever be strong enough to rule. She had not known, had never once imagined, that in the years since she left, he had risen to command the entire territory. "You should not be here," Kane said suddenly, panic sharpening his voice, as a new fear crossed his face, one that had nothing to do with Mara at all. "Alpha, if word spreads that you walked into a human diner in the middle of the night without an escort, then word will spread," Damien said simply, "and it will be true." He turned back to Mara, and whatever authority had filled the room a moment ago softened, just slightly, just for her. "Are you truly unhurt?" he asked again, quieter this time, meant only for her. "I'm unhurt," Mara said, confused, but unhurt. "Good," he said, and something in the single word carried more relief than the sentence seemed to deserve. It was at that moment that a second sound rippled through the diner, one that made even Damien go still. From outside, through the large front windows, more figures had begun to appear, stepping out of two dark vehicles that had pulled quietly into the lot without any of them noticing. 6 men in total, moving with the same disciplined precision Kane's group had shown earlier, though these 6 carried themselves with even greater sharpness, even greater control. They filed into the diner one after another, and the moment the first of them crossed the threshold and saw Mara standing there, free of the cuffs, his eyes widened, and his whole body straightened, as if pulled upright by an invisible string. "Commander Ellison," he said, and dropped immediately into a crisp, formal salute, his heels coming together with a sharp click against the tile floor. The 5 men behind him followed instantly, their movements so synchronized it looked almost rehearsed, though nothing about the moment had been planned. 6 grown men, each of them clearly powerful, clearly dangerous, all standing at rigid attention in the middle of a roadside diner at midnight, saluting a waitress in a stained apron, whose hands still bore the marks of cuffs that had been locked around them minutes earlier. Kane's mouth fell open. The color that had barely begun returning to his face drained away completely. "Commander?" he repeated, the word coming out strangled, disbelieving. Mara stood frozen amid the sea of saluting men, her mind spinning, old memories rising fast and unwelcome. Memories of a battlefield she had thought she left behind for good, of a title she had once carried with pride, and later carried like a weight she could not set down. "At ease," she said finally, the command slipping out of her mouth automatically, as natural as breathing, before she even realized she still remembered how to say it. The 6 men straightened out of their salutes instantly, though their eyes remained fixed on her with something close to awe. Kane turned slowly to look at Damien, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Alpha," he said carefully. "Who is she?" Damien's eyes did not leave Mara's face as he answered, his voice quiet, steady, and heavy with a history none of the younger men in the room could possibly understand. "She is the reason this territory still exists," he said, "and you have just made the worst mistake of your career." The diner fell silent again, but this silence was different from the one before. It was the silence of people realizing, all at once, that the story they thought they understood had just cracked wide open, revealing something far larger underneath. Mara looked around at the saluting soldiers, at Kane's stricken face, at Damien watching her with an expression she could not quite name, and felt the careful, quiet life she had built for herself over 5 long years beginning, piece by piece, to slip through her fingers. For a long moment, nobody moved. The 6 soldiers remained near the door, having lowered their salutes but not their attention, watching Mara the way soldiers watch a commander they had believed lost for good. Kane stood rooted beside the overturned chair, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to dread. Even Grace, still holding a dustpan she had fetched without anyone noticing, seemed unable to look away. Damien broke the silence first. "Everyone outside," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced the room minutes before. "All of you, now." The soldiers who had saluted Mara moved instantly, filing back out through the door with the same disciplined precision they had entered with. Kane hesitated, opening his mouth as though he might attempt some final explanation, but a single look from Damien sent him stumbling backward toward the exit without another word. Only the sandy-haired young man lingered a moment longer than the rest, glancing at Mara with something that looked almost like an apology, before he too disappeared through the door. When it was only the two of them left inside, along with Grace hovering uncertainly behind the counter, and the frightened customer who had not moved from her stool in 20 minutes, Damien turned to face Mara fully. "I should sit down," Mara said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, all her earlier sharpness momentarily gone. She lowered herself into the nearest booth, the vinyl seat creaking under her, and pressed her palms flat against the table to stop her hands from shaking. Damien sat across from her without asking permission, the way he used to, the way that had once felt natural between them, and now felt like trespassing on ground long since abandoned. "You look well," he said, and immediately seemed to regret how inadequate the words sounded. Mara let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I look like a waitress who just got handcuffed in front of her regular customers. I don't think well is the word you're looking for." "I meant that you look alive," Damien said quietly. "For 5 years, I did not know if that word applied to you at all." The bitterness in his voice caught her off guard, cutting through the numbness that had settled over her since the cuffs first closed around her wrists. She studied his face, searching for the boy she remembered, the one who had once laughed easily and argued with her over battle strategies until the sun came up. That boy seemed buried somewhere deep beneath the weight of whatever years had passed since she left. "You knew exactly where I was for at least the first year," Mara said, her tone flat. "Don't pretend otherwise." Something flickered across Damien's face. Guilt, perhaps, or old anger resurfacing. "I knew you were alive," he admitted. "I did not know if you were safe. I did not know if you were happy. I did not know if the people who drove you away had found you again." Mara looked down at her hands, at the faint red marks still visible on her wrists. "I built a quiet life," she said. "No titles, no salutes, no one calling me commander in the middle of a diner at midnight." "And yet here you are," Damien said, "still commanding a room without meaning to." Grace chose that moment to approach the booth, her hands twisting nervously in her apron, her eyes darting between the two of them, as though trying to piece together 20 years of history in the space of a single glance. "Mara, honey," she said carefully, "do you need anything? Water? Something stronger?" "I'm fine, Grace," Mara said, managing a small smile for the woman who had trained her on her very first shift years ago, and never once asked a single question about where she had come from before that. "Thank you." Grace nodded, though her eyes lingered a moment longer on Damien, before she retreated behind the counter, clearly deciding that whatever conversation was unfolding in that booth was far beyond anything she wanted to interrupt. "The man who cuffed you," Damien said once Grace was out of earshot. "His name is Kane Voss. He has served as my second for just over a year." "Your second," Mara repeated, "meaning he speaks for you, acts for you." "Meaning he is supposed to embody the standards I expect from every soldier under my command," Damien said, and the anger in his voice was unmistakable now, no longer aimed at her but at himself. Tonight he embodied nothing but arrogance. "He didn't know who I was," Mara pointed out, though she was not entirely sure why she felt the need to soften the moment. "To him, I was just a waitress who talked back." "That is precisely the problem," Damien said sharply. "It should never have mattered who you were. A waitress deserves the same respect as a commander. The fact that 6 of my soldiers only found their manners once they recognized your face tells me exactly how much rot has settled into this pack while you were gone." Mara studied him for a long moment, surprised by the intensity in his words. The Damien she remembered had cared about strength, about strategy, about survival above all else. This version of him, sitting across a cracked diner table, with guilt written plainly across his face, seemed to have grown into something more complicated. "What happens to him now?" she asked. "Kane. He is stripped of his rank pending a full review," Damien said without hesitation. "What happened here tonight will not be buried or excused because of his position, and if the review clears him—" "It will not," Damien said. "I heard everything from the parking lot. There is nothing to review, except how severely he should be punished." Mara exhaled slowly, unsure how she felt about the swiftness of the judgment, unsure of many things in that moment. She had spent 5 years trying to forget the rhythms of this world, the codes of conduct, the harsh discipline that governed every interaction between ranks. And now, in the space of one shift, all of it had reappeared, wrapped around her like a coat she thought she had thrown away long ago. "Why did you come here tonight, Damien?" she asked finally, the question she had been avoiding since the moment he walked through the door. "Of all the diners on all the roads in this territory, why here? Why now?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table between them rather than on her face, as if the answer cost him something to give. "I did not know you were here," he admitted. "I was passing through on my way back from a border meeting. I stopped because I needed coffee, and because my driver mentioned this place stayed open all night." He paused, and when he looked up again, his eyes held an emotion Mara could not quite name. "I have told myself for 5 years that if I ever found you again, it would not matter. That too much time had passed. That whatever we once had belonged to people who no longer existed. And now?" Mara asked quietly. "Now I am sitting across from you in a diner that smells like burnt coffee," Damien said, "and I am finding it very difficult to remember why I ever believed that." Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Outside, through the large front windows, the 6 soldiers stood waiting beside the dark vehicles, patient and silent, while Kane paced a short distance away, his hands pressed against his temples as though trying to physically hold his composure together. "I'm not the same person you remember," Mara said finally. "I left for reasons that had nothing to do with stopping loving this life. I left because staying nearly destroyed me." Damien's jaw tightened. "I know," he said, "and I intend to find out exactly how that happened, no matter how long it takes or who it implicates." Something in the certainty of his voice, the same certainty he had once used to promise her safety long ago, sent a chill down Mara's spine, though she could not yet tell whether it was fear or the faint, dangerous stirring of hope. 5 years earlier, the border war had nearly ended everything Damien Ashgrove was fighting to protect, and it was Mara Ellison who had stopped it from doing exactly that. She had not been born into the pack world at all. She had grown up in a small farming town, 200 miles from the nearest pack territory, the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, with no knowledge that the strange stories her grandmother used to tell about wolves in the hills were anything more than folklore. It was only when a rival pack, desperate and cornered, had raided the border town where she happened to be working as a young logistics coordinator for a transport company, that her life collided with a world she never knew existed. That night, when the fighting spilled into the streets and half the town was left in chaos, it had been Mara, of all people, who calmly organized the evacuation routes, redirected the fleeing townspeople away from the fighting, and, without any training in warfare whatsoever, spotted the flaw in the attacking pack's formation that no one else in the chaos had noticed. She had shouted the observation to a young, exhausted alpha in training named Damien Ashgrove, who had been fighting on instinct alone and losing ground fast. He listened. It saved his men. From that single night, an unlikely partnership was born. Damien, still years away from claiming full leadership of his territory, had recognized something in Mara that his own advisors dismissed outright: a mind built for strategy, sharp enough to see patterns in chaos that trained soldiers missed entirely. Over the following 2 years, as Damien fought to consolidate power across a fractured territory, plagued by smaller packs constantly testing his authority, Mara rose from an outsider with no rank to a trusted commander whose battle plans were followed without question. It had not been easy. Many within the pack resented her from the start, uncomfortable with the idea of a human holding real influence over matters of war and leadership. She had faced whispered insults in hallways, deliberate exclusion from meetings she had every right to attend, and more than one attempt to undermine her authority in front of soldiers she was meant to command. She endured all of it, not because she loved the fighting or the politics, but because she believed, fiercely, in the man she was helping to build a stronger, fairer territory. And somewhere in those 2 years, belief had quietly become something else. Nobody in the pack ever officially acknowledged the relationship that grew between Mara and Damien. It existed in careful, guarded moments, a hand lingering too long during a strategy briefing, a shared look across a crowded war room that said more than either of them dared to say aloud, late nights spent poring over maps that somehow always ended with far more conversation than planning. Damien, still fighting for the throne that would eventually make him the undisputed alpha king of the entire territory, could not afford the appearance of weakness, and a public relationship with a human commander would have handed his rivals exactly the weapon they were looking for. So they kept it hidden, and for a while, hidden felt like enough. The turning point came during the final battle for the Northern Ridge, a conflict that would determine, once and for all, whether Damien's claim to leadership would stand or collapse. The opposing forces, led by a rival named Holt Bramwell who had spent years building alliances specifically to challenge Damien's rise, had planned a devastating ambush meant to strike during the coronation ceremony itself, when Damien would be at his most vulnerable, surrounded by supporters but stripped of his usual defenses in accordance with tradition. It was Mara who uncovered the plot, 3 days before it was meant to happen, buried inside a set of supply requisition documents that any other reader would have dismissed as routine paperwork. She recognized the pattern instantly, resources being quietly redirected toward the exact location of the coronation, timed with unsettling precision. She brought the discovery straight to Damien, working through the night alongside him and a small circle of trusted advisors to rebuild the ceremony's security from the ground up without alerting Bramwell that his plan had been discovered. The ambush failed spectacularly. Bramwell's forces, expecting an unguarded target, instead walked directly into a defense Mara had personally designed, one that trapped them between two flanks before they even realized their plan had been exposed. Damien was crowned Alpha King 3 days later, standing over the wreckage of the last serious challenge to his authority, and it was Mara Ellison, standing quietly at the edge of the ceremony in plain clothes, rather than any uniform of rank, who had made that victory possible. That night, after the celebrations had finally quieted and the war room emptied of advisors and soldiers, Damien had found her alone on a balcony overlooking the territory he now ruled completely, and he had told her, plainly and without the careful hedging that colored every other conversation between them, that he did not know how to rule this territory without her beside him. She had believed him completely, which was why, less than 4 months later, when everything fell apart, it broke something in her that had never fully healed. A report surfaced, seemingly ironclad, claiming that Mara had been secretly feeding strategic information to a smaller rival pack in exchange for protection should Damien's rule ever collapse. The evidence was detailed, specific, and devastatingly convincing to advisors who had never trusted her in the first place. Meetings were held without her knowledge. Whispers spread through the pack faster than any denial could catch up to them. And Damien, newly crowned, still fighting daily battles to secure loyalty from advisors who had opposed his rise, found himself trapped between defending the woman he loved and appearing weak in front of a court that was watching his every decision for signs of vulnerability. He had hesitated. It had only been for a matter of days, a brief silence while he insisted on investigating the claims properly, rather than dismissing them outright. A silence he had believed at the time was the responsible choice of a leader who could not simply ignore accusations without proof. But to Mara, standing alone in a court full of people who had wanted her gone from the beginning, that silence had felt like betrayal all the same. By the time Damien uncovered enough evidence to prove the report had been fabricated, Mara Ellison had already vanished from the territory entirely, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment and a single unfinished letter that he had found tucked beneath a stack of old maps, its final sentence left incomplete. For 5 years, he had searched for her in every quiet, unofficial way available to a man who could not risk drawing attention to the search without reopening old wounds across the entire territory. And for 5 years, he had found nothing, until the night his car happened to stop outside a small roadside diner for nothing more than a cup of coffee. Back in the present, sitting across from him in the same booth where she had served countless strangers over the past 3 years, Mara found herself surprised by how easily the old anger returned, as fresh and sharp as the day she had packed a single bag and driven until the territory disappeared behind her in the rearview mirror. "You want to know why I really left," she said, not quite a question. "I have told myself the answer for 5 years," Damien said quietly. "I would rather hear it from you than continue guessing." Mara wrapped her hands around the coffee mug Grace had quietly set down in front of her without either of them noticing, letting the warmth ground her before she spoke. "It wasn't the accusation itself," she said. "Lies get told about people all the time. I could have survived being falsely accused. What I could not survive was watching an entire court decide, within a single afternoon, that everything I had done for that territory meant nothing the moment someone whispered the word traitor." "I never believed it," Damien said. "I know that now," Mara said, and there was no comfort in the admission, only old exhaustion. "But you didn't say it then. Not loudly enough, not fast enough. You stood in front of your advisors and told them you needed time to investigate properly, as if my loyalty were a policy question, rather than something you should have known in your bones. Damien flinched, though he did not look away. I was trying to protect you, he said. If I had defended you without proof, in front of advisors already looking for any excuse to claim I ruled with my heart instead of my judgment, they would have used it against both of us. I thought silence, temporary silence, was the safer path. Safer for the throne, Mara said. Not safer for me. The words landed heavily between them, and Damien sat back slightly, as if absorbing a blow he had been expecting for 5 years and had still not fully prepared for. You're right, he said finally. I chose the throne's stability over your certainty that I believed you. I told myself it was strategy. Looking back, I think it was fear. I had just become Alpha King. I did not yet trust my own authority enough to defend you the way I should have, publicly, immediately, without hesitation. Mara studied him, searching his face for the practiced diplomacy she remembered from court, the careful phrasing, designed to smooth over difficult truths. She found none of it now, only tiredness, and something that looked uncomfortably like regret that had been carried, unspoken, for half a decade. Where did you go? He asked. After you left. I searched, Mara, quietly, carefully, but I searched. I know you did, Mara said. I heard about it, eventually, from people who still had contacts in the territory. That's partly why I kept moving for the first year. I didn't trust that a search meant safety. I only trusted that it meant more attention, and attention was the last thing I wanted. And after the first year? After the first year, I found this town, Mara said, glancing briefly around the diner, as though seeing it fresh for the first time. Grace gave me a job without asking a single question about where I came from. I found an apartment with a landlord who didn't care about my history as long as the rent came on time. I built something quiet, something that was entirely mine. Were you happy? Damien asked, and the question seemed to cost him something to ask. Mara considered it honestly, turning the question over the way she once turned over battle plans, searching for the truthful answer rather than the comfortable one. I was safe, she said finally. Safety and happiness aren't always the same thing, but after everything that happened, safety felt like enough. Damien nodded slowly, accepting the answer, even though it clearly was not the one he had hoped for. The person who created the false report, he said, shifting the conversation onto steadier ground, was never identified. I spent months trying to trace its origin, but whoever built it covered their trail carefully, far more carefully than an ordinary rival would have bothered to. Mara's eyes sharpened at that, old instincts stirring beneath the exhaustion. That should have told you something, she said. An ordinary rival wants credit, at least eventually, once the damage is done. Whoever did this wanted the damage without ever being connected to it. I reached the same conclusion, Damien said, which means whoever it was likely still holds a position close enough to the throne to have accessed the kind of information used in that report in the first place. Meaning they're still there, Mara said slowly. Still inside your court. Meaning, Damien said, his voice hardening, that whoever destroyed the life you built 5 years ago may have spent that same time quietly strengthening their position while you were gone, and I was left believing the trail had gone cold. Mara sat back against the worn vinyl booth, the weight of the realization settling over her slowly. She had spent 5 years telling herself that the past was finished, that the people who had wanted her gone had gotten exactly what they wanted and moved on to whatever ambitions came next. The idea that the danger might still be active, still embedded somewhere close to the throne, waiting patiently for an opportunity, sent a familiar, unwelcome sharpness back into her thinking, the same clarity that had once made her the best strategist Damien's court had ever known. I didn't come back to reopen this, she said quietly, though the words felt less certain even as she spoke them. I know, Damien said, but I think, whether either of us wanted it or not, this found you again tonight the moment Kane decided to put those cuffs on your wrists. Outside, through the window, Kane still paced near the dark vehicles, his fate hanging over him unspoken, while the 6 soldiers who had saluted Mara stood in patient silence, waiting for whatever came next. Mara looked down at the faint red marks on her wrists one last time, then up at the man who had once promised her a life she believed in completely, and felt the quiet, careful walls she had spent 5 years building begin, slowly and against her will, to crack. Kane Voss stood outside the diner with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing in particular, running through every version of an explanation he might offer and finding each one weaker than the last. He had served as Damien's second for just over a year, clawing his way into the position through relentless discipline and an unwavering belief that strength meant never showing hesitation, never showing doubt, never allowing anyone beneath him to feel they held even a moment of leverage. Tonight, that belief had shattered in the space of 10 minutes. When Damien finally stepped outside the diner, the 6 soldiers straightened instantly, and Kane felt his stomach drop before a single word had even been spoken. "Walk with me," Damien said, and it was not a request. Kane fell into step beside him, matching his pace across the empty parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath their boots, the only sound apart from the distant hum of a highway a half-mile away. Neither of them spoke until they had moved far enough from the soldiers and the dark vehicles that the conversation could remain private. "Explain to me," Damien said finally, "what you believed you were doing tonight." "She spoke back to me," Kane said, though even as the words left his mouth he heard how hollow they sounded, compared to how certain he had felt only an hour earlier. "I have never allowed disrespect to go unanswered. It is how I have always operated. It is how you trained me to operate." Damien stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "I trained you to demand respect through your actions," he said, "not to manufacture it through fear, directed at people who hold no power to resist you. There is no strength in cuffing a waitress who told you where to find a water jug. I did not know she was." "That is the entire problem," Damien said, his voice sharp enough now to make Kane flinch. "You should never have needed to know who she was before deciding she deserved basic respect. A waitress, a stranger, anyone at all who crossed your path tonight deserved better than what you gave her, and the only reason you are standing here shaken rather than proud is because it turned out she outranked every soldier standing in that parking lot." Kane said nothing, the truth of the accusation settling over him with a weight he could not argue against. If she had truly been nothing more than a waitress with no history in this territory, Damien continued, would you be standing here right now regretting what you did? Or would you have driven away from that diner satisfied, believing you had taught someone a valuable lesson? The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than anything Kane could have said aloud. "You are relieved of your position, effective immediately," Damien said. "A formal review will determine what further consequences follow, but I want to be clear that this is not a punishment born from embarrassment over who she turned out to be. It is a punishment born from what you revealed about your character the moment you believed she was powerless." "Alpha, please," Kane said, his composure finally cracking entirely, the fear in his voice raw and unguarded. "I have served this territory faithfully. One mistake should not undo everything I have built." "This was not a small mistake," Damien said. "This was a demonstration of exactly the kind of leadership I have spent years trying to eliminate from this territory. Strength that only respects strength is not strength at all. It is cruelty wearing a uniform, and I will not have it standing beside me representing my authority." Kane lowered his eyes, the fight draining out of him as the full weight of the consequence settled in. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now you return to the compound and await the review," Damien said. "And you spend whatever time that takes, reflecting honestly on why you believed cuffing someone who could not fight back was ever an acceptable use of the power given to you." Kane nodded slowly, defeated, and turned to walk back toward the waiting vehicles without another word, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the quiet realization that the career he had spent a year building had likely ended the moment his hand closed around Mara's wrist. Damien watched him go, then turned back toward the diner, where through the window he could see Mara still seated in the booth, watching the exchange with careful, measured attention, the same expression she used to wear during war councils years ago, when weighing whether a decision had been fair. When he stepped back inside, she looked up at him. "You didn't need to make an example of him in front of me," she said. "I wasn't making an example," Damien said, sliding back into the booth across from her. "I was doing what should have happened the moment those cuffs touched your wrists, regardless of who was watching." "And if I had truly been nobody?" Mara asked, echoing the exact question Damien had put to Kane moments earlier, though she could not have known that. "If I really was just a waitress with no history in your territory, would the punishment have been the same?" "Yes," Damien said, without a moment's hesitation. "Because the crime was never about who you turned out to be. It was about what he assumed the moment he believed no one would push back. Mara studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of the careful diplomacy she remembered. The political calculation that once colored every decision he made as a young leader, still fighting to secure his throne. She found none of it now. Only conviction, steady and unshaken, the kind that used to be rare in him, and now seemed to sit at the very center of who he had become. "You've changed," she said quietly. 5 years is a long time, Damien said. "I would like to think I learned something from losing what mattered most to me." Outside, the vehicles carrying Kane and the soldiers pulled slowly out of the parking lot, leaving only the 2 dark cars that had brought Damien himself, along with the small handful of guards who remained near the entrance, giving the 2 of them space without ever fully losing sight of the diner. Mara wrapped her hands around her cooling coffee mug once more, aware that the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself over the last 3 years now stood at a crossroads she had never wanted to face again, and yet, sitting across from the man who had once broken her heart through nothing more than a moment of hesitation, she found herself unwilling to simply walk away. Grace finally approached again, cautiously refilling both of their mugs though neither had asked, before retreating once more to give them privacy, though Mara suspected the older woman was listening from behind the counter as closely as she dared. "I owe you a real apology," Damien said, once Grace was out of earshot again. "Not for tonight. For 5 years ago. I have rehearsed this conversation more times than I would like to admit, and every version I imagined felt inadequate the moment I pictured saying it to your face." "Then don't rehearse it," Mara said. "Just say it plainly." Damien nodded, gathering himself. "I failed you when it mattered most," he said. "Not because I doubted your loyalty, but because I let the fear of appearing weak outweigh my responsibility to defend you immediately and completely. You deserved a leader willing to stand beside you the instant the accusation was made, not one who calculated the political cost of doing so first." Mara listened without interrupting, letting the words settle rather than rushing to either forgive or dismiss them. "I have spent 5 years turning that failure over in my mind," Damien continued. "I told myself, at the time, that hesitation was wisdom, that a leader who acts too quickly on emotion invites chaos. But watching you disappear because of that hesitation taught me that some decisions cannot wait for perfect information. Some decisions require trusting the people who have already earned it." "That's a very tidy lesson to have learned," Mara said, though there was no real bitterness left in her voice, only weariness. "I'm glad 5 years of guilt produced something useful." "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," Damien said. "I know that isn't something a single conversation in a diner can fix. I only need you to understand that I have carried this, every day, since the moment I found that unfinished letter under a stack of maps." Mara's breath caught slightly at the mention of the letter, one she had almost forgotten writing, abandoned halfway through a sentence she had never found the courage to finish. "What did it say?" she asked quietly. "The part you found." "It said that you had loved this territory enough to nearly die for it more than once," Damien said, his voice quieter now, "and that you had loved me the same way, until you realized loving me meant standing alone the moment it truly mattered." The words hung heavily between them, and Mara looked down at her coffee rather than meet his eyes, the old ache resurfacing with a clarity she had spent years trying to dull. "I didn't come back tonight to reopen any of this," she said again, though this time the words carried less conviction than before. "I came back because Grace needed a second shift covered, and this town happened to be close enough to make sense. That's the whole story. I wasn't looking for you, Damien. I wasn't looking for any of this." "I understand that," Damien said, "and I am not asking you to want anything you don't already want. I am only asking you to consider one thing, before you decide this conversation ends here." "What's that?" "Whoever created that false report 5 years ago is very likely still active within my court," Damien said, "still positioned close enough to power to have accessed sensitive information at the exact moment it would do the most damage. If they orchestrated your downfall once to remove you as a threat to their influence, there is no reason to believe they have stopped scheming in the years since." Mara's jaw tightened, old instincts sharpening beneath the exhaustion of the night. "You think I could still be a target," she said. "I think," Damien said carefully, "that the moment word spreads that 6 of my soldiers saluted a diner waitress tonight, whoever engineered your disappearance will know exactly who you are and exactly where to find you. Word travels fast in this territory, faster than either of us would like. The realization settled over Mara slowly, cold and unwelcome. She had built a quiet life, specifically to avoid ever being found again, and in the space of a single shift, that anonymity had been stripped away entirely, not by her own choice, but by circumstances she had never invited. "So I don't actually have a choice anymore," she said. "You always have a choice," Damien said, "but I would be lying if I said the choice to simply return to an ordinary life remains as safe tonight as it seemed this morning." Mara sat with that for a long moment, weighing the quiet, careful existence she had built against the old, sharpened instincts already stirring beneath her exhaustion, instincts that had once made her the most valuable strategist Damien's court had ever known. "If I help you find whoever did this," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "it is not because I am coming back to you. It is because I refuse to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder for a threat I could have eliminated years ago if I had simply had the chance to fight back properly." "I would not ask you to return for any other reason," Damien said. "I only need your mind on this, nothing more." Mara studied him carefully, searching his face for any trace of manipulation, any sign that his request carried hidden motives beyond what he claimed. She found none, only the same steady conviction she had noticed earlier, tempered now by something that looked almost like restraint, as if he were deliberately holding back words he wanted to say, but knew she was not ready to hear. "I have conditions," she said finally. "Name them." "I keep my own residence. I am not moving into your compound, and I am not accepting any formal reinstatement of rank, unless I decide that myself, on my own timeline. I assist with the investigation as an advisor, nothing more, and the moment it is resolved, I walk away again, if that is what I choose." Damien considered her terms carefully, and Mara half expected him to argue, to push for something closer to what they once had. Instead, he simply nodded. "Agreed," he said. "Every condition." Mara exhaled slowly, surprised by how much she had braced herself for resistance that never came. "Then I suppose," she said, "my quiet life is officially over." "For now," Damien said, "though I would like to believe that whatever comes after this investigation might still be something quiet, eventually, if you decide you want it to be." Mara did not answer that. She simply picked up her coffee, finally cold, and drank it anyway, staring out through the window at the dark parking lot where her old life and her new one had just collided completely. 3 days later, Mara stood in a records room deep within Damien's compound, surrounded by boxes of old requisition documents she had once memorized by heart, back when she was the commander responsible for tracking every resource that moved through the territory. The room smelled of paper and dust, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, but none of it mattered to her as she worked, her mind falling back into old patterns with unsettling ease. An assistant named Ivy, young and eager, sharp-eyed in a way that reminded Mara faintly of herself at that age, had been assigned to help her sort through years of archived reports. Ivy had not been part of the pack 5 years ago, which meant she carried none of the old suspicion that had once followed Mara through every hallway, and Mara found herself grateful for the small mercy of working alongside someone who simply respected her competence, without any complicated history attached. "These are the supply logs from the month before the coronation," Ivy said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "And these are the ones from the weeks immediately following your departure. Commander Voss said you specifically wanted both sets compared." "Not Commander Voss anymore," Mara said absently, scanning the first folder. "Just Kane, I imagine, until the review concludes." Ivy flushed slightly, embarrassed by the slip, but Mara waved it off without looking up, already deep in the numbers spread across the pages in front of her. The false report that had destroyed her reputation 5 years earlier had claimed she funneled strategic supply information to a rival pack in exchange for future protection. At the time, panicked and blindsided, she had not been given the opportunity to examine the evidence herself before it spread through the court as settled fact. Now, with time, distance, and the clear head that had once made her invaluable to Damien's war councils, she approached it the way she would approach any battlefield problem, methodically, patiently, without emotion clouding the analysis. The forged documents, she noticed almost immediately, contained a specific formatting inconsistency, a particular numbering system for supply codes that had only been introduced into official use roughly 2 months before the coronation. Whoever created the false report had used the newer numbering system throughout, which meant they had access to internal formatting changes that had not yet been distributed outside a very small circle of senior logistics officers. This narrows things considerably, Mara murmured, more to herself than to Ivy. Narrows what? Ivy asked, leaning closer. Whoever built this report needed access to formatting protocols that weren't distributed pack-wide yet, Mara said. That means it wasn't some outside rival pack cobbling together a convincing forgery from stolen scraps of information. It was someone inside the senior logistics circle, someone with direct access to internal systems, before most of the pack even knew those systems existed. Ivy's eyes widened. How many people would that have included 5 years ago? Fewer than a dozen, Mara said, already pulling a second folder toward her, cross-referencing names against assignments from that period, and most of them I trusted completely at the time. She spent the next several hours building a list, narrowing the dozen names down through elimination, checking who had been present in the compound during the exact window the report must have been assembled, who had access to the specific archive terminal used to generate the formatting, who had motive strong enough to want her removed entirely from Damien's court. By the time Damien arrived that evening, having been occupied most of the day with the ongoing review of Kane's conduct, Mara had narrowed the list to 3 names, and one of them made her blood run cold the moment she saw it typed plainly on the page in front of her. Holt Bramwell's son, she said quietly, when Damien stepped into the records room and saw the look on her face. Corin Bramwell, Damien said, reading over her shoulder, his expression darkening immediately. He has served in logistics for 6 years. He was barely more than a boy when his father tried to seize the throne during the coronation ambush. Old enough to remember exactly how it ended, Mara said. Old enough to want revenge for what happened to his father, and patient enough to spend 6 years quietly building the access necessary to take it. You believe he engineered your downfall to weaken me, Damien said slowly, by removing the one advisor who exposed his father's plot in the first place. It fits every piece of evidence in front of us, Mara said. He had the access. He had the motive. And he had 6 years afterward to entrench himself so deeply in your logistics operations that no one would think to question him. Damien was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of the discovery. If you're right, he said finally, then he has spent 6 years working beside advisors who trust him completely, waiting for another opportunity to weaken this court from the inside. I want to be very sure before we act, Mara said. An accusation without solid proof destroyed my career once already. I will not repeat that mistake by making one against someone else without absolute certainty. Then we confirm it properly, Damien said, quietly, carefully, before he has any reason to suspect we're looking in his direction. Mara nodded, already pulling out a fresh sheet of paper to begin mapping out exactly how they would test the theory, without alerting Corin Bramwell that 6 years of careful patience were about to unravel in front of him. Outside the records room window, the compound settled into evening, lights flickering on across the courtyard, as soldiers changed shifts and advisors returned to their quarters, none of them aware that somewhere among their ranks, a plan set in motion 6 years earlier, was finally, quietly, coming undone. The plan Mara designed was simple in structure but demanding in execution, exactly the kind of strategy she used to build years earlier, when she still carried the title of commander without hesitation. She and Damien would allow a single piece of false information to circulate quietly through the logistics division, information suggesting that an old supply route once used during the coronation ambush was being reopened for a routine inspection. If Corin Bramwell truly still harbored resentment, tied to his father's failed plot, and if he still held the access his position afforded him, he would not be able to resist confirming whether the old route's records had ever been fully erased. They planted the information on a Tuesday morning, through a conversation Ivy staged carefully within earshot of the logistics office, never once looking toward Corin as she spoke, exactly as Mara had instructed. By Wednesday evening, the archive terminal Corin used for his official duties logged an unauthorized access attempt into records that had nothing to do with any current assignment, a search specifically targeting old supply route documentation from 5 years earlier. He took the bait, Ivy said, breathless, when she found Mara in the records room late that night. Mara felt no satisfaction in the confirmation, only the cold, familiar clarity that used to settle over her before every major decision she made as commander. Bring it to Damien, she said, quietly. We do this properly. The confrontation took place 2 days later, in the same war room where Mara had once spent countless nights years earlier, mapping strategies alongside advisors who had never fully trusted her. The room had changed little. The same long table, the same worn maps pinned along one wall, though the faces gathered around it now were different, apart from a handful of senior advisors who remembered exactly who Mara Ellison had once been. Corin Bramwell arrived expecting a routine logistics briefing, dressed neatly, his expression calm and composed in the way of someone who had spent 6 years perfecting the appearance of loyalty. That composure held for exactly as long as it took him to notice Mara seated at the table, folder open in front of her, watching him, with the same steady attention she once used during war councils. "Commander Ellison," he said carefully, recovering quickly, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the door before he caught himself. "Sit down, Corin," Damien said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he had shown earlier that week, only the flat, unshakable authority of a leader who already knew the answer to every question he was about to ask. Corin sat, though his hands, folded on the table in front of him, were not quite steady. 5 years ago, Damien began, a fabricated report destroyed the career of the most capable strategist this court has ever known. That report used internal formatting protocols available to fewer than a dozen people at the time. This week, someone accessed archived records, tied directly to the ambush your father orchestrated during my coronation, using a terminal assigned specifically to you. Corin's face paled, though he attempted, briefly, to hold his composure. "I have no idea what you're referring to," he said. "Perhaps the terminal logs are mistaken." "The terminal logs are precise," Mara said, sliding a printed record across the table toward him. "And the formatting used in the false report matches protocols that were only distributed to senior logistics staff 2 months before the coronation. You were one of exactly 11 people with that access." "Plenty of people had that access," Corin said, though his voice had begun to shake. 10 of those 11 people have accounted for every hour of the week the report was created," Mara said calmly. "You are the only one who cannot." The room fell silent, every advisor present watching Corin with growing unease, as the careful mask he had worn for 6 years began to crack in front of them. "My father lost everything because of her," Corin said finally, his voice rising, all pretense of calm abandoned as the accusation landed fully. "She exposed his plan. She humiliated him in front of the entire territory. He died 3 years later, broken, having lost everything he worked to build, and she walked away with commendations while my family was left with nothing. Your father tried to murder an entire coronation ceremony to seize power that was never his to take," Damien said, his voice hard as stone. "Mara exposed a plot that would have killed dozens of innocent people, including soldiers who had nothing to do with your family's ambitions. Whatever grievance you carry does not excuse destroying an innocent life to settle a score 5 years in the making. She should never have been trusted in the first place," Corin spat. "A human, advising an alpha, holding rank over wolves who had earned their place through generations of service. I did what should have been done from the beginning. I removed her." "You did not remove a threat," Mara said quietly, the calm in her voice more devastating than any raised anger could have been. "You destroyed someone who spent 2 years trying to protect the same territory your father tried to burn to the ground. And you did it not out of loyalty to this pack, but out of grief you were never willing to let go of." Corin said nothing further, his silence itself an admission, and the advisors seated around the table exchanged glances heavy with the understanding that 6 years of careful trust had been built on a foundation of quiet, patient revenge. "You will be held pending judgment," Damien said, rising from his seat, his voice final. "What happens to you now depends entirely on how honestly you cooperate with what comes next. But know this, whatever grievance you carried, it does not disappear tonight simply because it has finally been exposed." 2 guards stepped forward to escort Corin from the room, his shoulders slumped, the careful composure he had maintained for 6 years finally, completely gone. When the door closed behind them, the war room fell into a heavy silence, and Mara sat back in her chair, feeling, for the first time in 5 years, the quiet, uncomfortable relief of a wound she had carried, without knowing its true shape, finally beginning to close. In the weeks that followed, the territory settled slowly back into its ordinary rhythms, though nothing about it felt entirely ordinary to Mara anymore. Word of Corin Bramwell's judgment spread quietly through the pack, along with the truth of what had happened 5 years earlier. and for the first time since her disappearance, Mara found herself walking through the compound without the weight of old suspicion following every step. Kane Voss's formal review concluded with his permanent removal from any position of command, though Damien, after much consideration, allowed him a path back into the pack through years of supervised service rather than outright exile. Mara had not asked for leniency on his behalf, but she also had not objected when Damien described the decision to her, understanding, perhaps better than most, that people were capable of learning from failure if given the chance, though the chance had to be earned rather than assumed. Grace kept Mara's old apron hanging behind the diner counter for weeks. After the night everything changed, half expecting her to return for another shift, though both of them understood, without ever needing to say it aloud, that the quiet chapter of Mara's life, spent pouring coffee and dodging rude customers, had likely closed for good. Damien offered Mara her old rank back, exactly 1 month after Corin's judgment, formally, in front of the same war room where the confrontation had taken place, surrounded by advisors, who now regarded her with something closer to respect than suspicion. She had listened to the offer carefully, weighing it the way she weighed every serious decision, and had ultimately declined the exact title she once held. "I don't want my old position," she told him, once the room had emptied, and it was only the two of them left standing beside the long table. "I want a new one. Advisor on strategic security, answerable only to you, with the authority to investigate anything I believe threatens this territory, without needing anyone's permission first." Damien had smiled at that, a real smile, the first one she had seen from him since the night in the diner. "Done," he said simply. "Though I suspect you would have taken the position with or without my approval." "Probably," Mara admitted, "but it's nicer when you agree." Their relationship, in those following weeks, remained something neither of them rushed to define. Mara kept her own small residence within the territory, rather than moving into the compound, a boundary Damien respected without argument, understanding that trust, once broken as thoroughly as theirs had been, needed to be rebuilt slowly, rather than assumed back into place overnight. But there were quiet moments, evenings spent going over reports together long after official business concluded, conversations that drifted naturally from strategy into memory and back again, and somewhere in those small, ordinary moments, something old and familiar began to grow steady roots once more. It was nearly 2 months after the night in the diner, when Damien finally said plainly what he had clearly been holding back, since the moment he watched the cuffs fall from her wrists. "I am not asking you to promise me forever," he said, standing beside her on the same balcony where, 5 years earlier, he had once told her he did not know how to rule without her. "I understand that trust takes longer to rebuild than a single conversation, no matter how many times I might wish otherwise. But I want you to know, clearly, without hesitation this time, that I want you beside me, not simply as an advisor, not simply as the commander who once saved this territory. I want you beside me as the person I should have defended without a moment's pause 5 years ago." Mara looked out over the territory stretched below them, the lights of the compound flickering steadily against the darkening sky, and thought of everything that had led her back to this exact spot after 5 years of careful, deliberate distance. The diner, the cuffs, the salute that had cracked open a life she thought she had buried for good. "I'm not promising forever," she said finally, echoing his own words back to him. "I don't know if I'm ready for that yet, and I won't pretend otherwise, just because it would be easier to hear." "I'm not asking for that," Damien said quietly. "But I'm not walking away either," Mara said, turning to face him fully for the first time. "Not tonight. And for now, that's the most honest answer I can give you." Damien studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to be enough, because the tension he had carried since the moment he found her in that diner finally eased from his shoulders, replaced by something quieter, steadier, something that looked very much like patience. "Then for now," he said, "I'll take it." Below them, the territory settled into the quiet hum of evening, soldiers changing posts, lights flickering on across the compound, an entire pack moving forward into a future neither Mara nor Damien could fully predict. But for the first time in 5 years, standing side by side on that same balcony, neither of them felt the need to run from whatever came next.